Hello, and thanks for joining us today for ACI Learning's Audit webinar. Have a question? Use the GoToWebinar question box and we will answer as many as we can at the end. Now let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to the ACI Learning's webinar series. I'm Kelly Mack, and thank you for joining us. Today, our presenter, Ron Woerner, will talk about risk management, supply chain audit, alongside Dr. Hernan Murdock, ACI Learning Audit Instructor. Ron is the CEO, President, and Chief Cybersecurity Consultant at Cyber AAA, where he develops and delivers cybersecurity, privacy, and IT education, along with training content across a variety of platforms. He's been in the industry for more than 20 years and has spoken at events like RSA and TEDx. Dr. Hernan Murdock speaks at conferences in the U.S. and abroad and is the author of numerous articles and books on a variety of topics, including internal audit, fraud, and more. He holds professional designations as a CIA and CRMA. He currently serves as the Vice President of Audit Content at ACI Learning. So, what exactly is ACI Learning? ACI Learning trains leaders in audit, cybersecurity, and IT, delivering lifetime learning to over 250,000 engaged students, professionals, and organizations across 6 continents. Many of you attending today may know or have heard of the MIS Training Institute, or MISTI. MISTI has been training auditors, risk and compliance, fraud, and information security professionals worldwide for over 40 years. MISTI is now part of and is being rebranded as ACI Learning. Check us out at acilearning.com and follow us on your favorite social media. We'd love to get questions from you as we go along. Please put your questions in the question panel in GoToWebinar on the right side of your screen. We'll be sure to get to your questions after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within a week. You can also download today's slides and any additional handouts by clicking on the links in the handouts panel. Now, let's welcome Ron and Hernan to today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. Where would you guys like to begin?
Hello, Ron. Welcome. So good to see you. So good to spend this time with you talking about such a hot topic. How are you today?
I am fantastic. How about yourself?
I am doing very well, thank you. Well, let's begin by something that I've noticed over the last few months, if not a few years, and that is it appears as though there's an increasing number and magnitude of cyber attacks. And I was wondering if you could start us out there. Is that just me, or is that really happening? Is that really a problem?
Oh, we continue to see an upward trend. If you look at the Verizon data breach report, as well as the other similar types of data breach reports, it only continues to scale up. Where we're seeing an increasing trend, though, is no longer are the attacks directed at the organization. More attackers are taking an end around, going after the supply chain for the organization, which we'll be talking about throughout this webinar. But yes, Hernan, unfortunately, we continue to see an uptick in the number of events, incidents, and breaches, over 30,000 of them in 2021 alone.
Wow. Okay. So now this is troublesome because as we think about the organizations, they're increasingly depending on their technological infrastructure. And we have a lot of information flowing through and, of course, being stationed within organizations in terms of their databases and cloud services that we use and all of that. So we're relying increasingly on data and the flow of data. So if this is increasing, then it sounds to me like we have a situation here where, from a risk perspective, we need to be very much attuned to how it's impacting those relationships with those third parties. So tell us a little bit more about those risks and how it's impacting these third parties, our supply chain, because usually we think of it as manufacturing, right? But there's a supply chain related to cyber dynamics as well. So from a cybersecurity perspective, can we talk about some of those risks?
Oh, definitely. Think about where you fit. Who do you get your software and hardware from? Who do you provide software applications to? We are all connected in today's internet. We need to be asking ourselves, who are we reliant to do business? Is it a vendor application, maybe a cloud service provider, or even an IT technician? The attacker no longer needs to go after the organization directly. They can do it through that supply chain, say the network connections, software vendors, support services, application libraries, supply chain touch risks such as sourcing, vendor management, contracts, even as small maybe as cleaning crews. If you think about who's cleaning your offices, they may have access to your computer systems during off hours. All of that is considered a part of the supply chain ecosystem needed to design, manufacture, and distribute a product.
Mhm. So one of the things you mentioned is compromised equipment. And I was wondering if we could dig in a little bit in that space there. One of the things that I heard, and I'm just going to run this by you, for example, in medical equipment, some of it was designed not with cybersecurity in mind, it was just from a functional perspective. So the security was not built in. We may also have a lot of our viewers who are probably relying extensively on legacy systems. I know, for example, from my experience as an auditor and consultant, that a lot of organizations, for example, in banking, in financial service in general, so banking, insurance, and so on, they were early adopters of technology back in the 70s, early 80s, and of course 90s. So they have a lot of legacy systems in place. And in some cases, they can be surprisingly weak when it comes to that. And
Mhm.
healthcare may also have some potential gaps in terms of their coverage. So can we dig in a little bit in that particular space there? Because I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
So there's two different thoughts there. One is the healthcare management systems. You're absolutely right, Hernan. I have a client who's a hospital. Common challenge is doctors are approached by suppliers. Hey, I have this really cool new toy, not quite toy, but to be able to help your patients. All you do is plug it into the network and we'll be able to remotely monitor patients across the internet. There's not always that assurance, though. Has that tool that is now plugged into your network been vetted for security? Is there security built into it? When they're building these IoT medical devices, they want to make sure they function first and foremost. Patient health and safety first and foremost in medical communities' mind. So they'll just think about that before they think about security. So that's why we need to have security as a part of the holistic process, building it in early. This way, before you plug something in, are you checking the security of that type of device, whether it's a medical device or an IoT device you have in your home? The other part of that is the legacy systems that you mentioned. Yes, that continues to be a challenge. We see this in many, not only manufacturing environments, but I've seen it in other types of, I worked in a hotel chain where they had an old application that ran on a Windows 7 system that we needed to make sure was
Wow.
segregated on the network, but that we had received from a vendor. And sometimes those vendors go out of business. So that's another form of supply chain risk. You purchase something, how do you know it'll be there in 2, 5, 10 years? We often think that we'll be replacing technology after a period of time. It tends to last quite a lot longer than we may expect.
Yeah, yeah. So those are definitely some interesting dynamics because as we think about what our environment looks like, right? We're thinking from a perspective of auditors, but compliance professionals and even users. We think about what organizations are using and doing, and how they're basically receiving, storing, processing, and then in some cases moving that data outside with some of their third parties, like we're talking now about supply chain. So that can definitely create some issues there because as individuals, even as citizens, we also need to be somewhat concerned about how that is being handled because data is being unfortunately compromised. Almost on a daily basis, and we don't want to have that happen to us. Unfortunately, some people even talk about it from the perspective of not just if it happens, but when it happens. So having your data compromised is never good, but we need to be very mindful and as best we can try to do whatever we can to help address that dynamic. Now, another thing that's I think very important here has to do when it comes to, for example, looking at malware and how that has also increased substantially. So some of the figures you were sharing with us earlier and some of the things that we're hearing from a lot of the organizations that collect this data and monitor the dynamics around this space, talking about the prevalence of malware, whether it is around email, even from SMS messages, even text messages that are now people are receiving as well. And there are so many others. But a lot of it is coming through email, for example. So we have malware dynamics playing out there where people are attacked organizationally because of their employer and all the emails that people process on a daily basis. But also when you think about at our personal level, when you have your own personal email account and you're also receiving emails and processing things there. So can we talk a little bit more about malware in that particular scenario? Because I believe that that is probably going to be something that's really, well, it is hot now from what I understand, and it's probably going to continue to be a troublesome dynamic. So malware, what are some of the key things? Just a couple ideas, couple recommendations, couple suggestions on what we can do there.
Hernan, we are definitely seeing supply chain attacks on the rise, where 62% of the supply chain attacks are because of malware being injected into the source code. For example, the attack on the US software firm Kaseya in July of 2021 affected over 1,500 businesses across the globe, injecting malware into your software provider. Another example may be if you get code from a GitHub repository. Your coders, your developers, they may just find that routine rather than them developing it themselves. They find one that's more open source, not realizing there could be malware injected into it. Over 60% focused on suppliers' code. So the type of attack we're seeing now, whether it's with Kaseya, SolarWinds, I'll talk about more of these attacks momentarily. No longer do I say attack you directly, Hernan. I find out what code you are using, what software you use. I may learn that through open source intelligence, through just having a conversation with you. It could be a survey, something as innocuous as, say, a LinkedIn survey to find out what products you're using. And then I find a way to inject my evil code into the software products you're using. And then I wait for that software product to have an update. The update is automatically pushed out to you and to others who use it, injecting my code, which may or may not be caught by standard antivirus procedures. These are just one of many different types of supply chain attacks we are seeing today.
Wow. Well, definitely eye-opening. Maybe makes a little bit nervous as well. But I mean, we need to know what's happening. So I guess at the end of the day, it's more about the education we need to receive, and as professionals, also to help organizations protect themselves and their stakeholders, customers, vendors, employees, etc. Now, can we talk some more about attack techniques? We just spoke a bit about malware. Thank you very much for helping us better understand what's happening there. But I believe there are a few other types of attack techniques. So can we elaborate further?
Certainly. Social engineering, as I mentioned with the previous example, is still very prevalent. You were talking about email compromise. Business email compromise is one of the top concerns in the United States for the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation, for them as part of their top concerns across the whole FBI. Phishing, we've been talking about phishing for how long? Still see it today, and it's more than just within email. Phishing across SMS, text messages, even in webinars like this. Fake applications, QR codes. So if I flash a QR code, say during a large sporting event on a TV, could I use that to affect potentially millions of people? To convince you to download my application, which may look like a cryptocurrency application, but really has malicious code as a part of a social engineering attack. Another, brute force, passwords. People still rely on single factor authentication with passwords. That's how the pipeline got attacked with ransomware last year. I mentioned software vulnerabilities, those who are not paying attention to OWASP top 10, even how you have your systems configured. And let's not forget, Hernan, physical access. In the age of the pandemic, we sometimes forget, well, we're safe, from physical attacks. Well, can I sneak into your office knowing you don't have your normal workforce there? Plug in a USB drive. USB drops, old-fashioned technique. You just throw a whole bunch of infected USBs in the parking lot to see which employees use them. Unfortunately, it still works today.
Interesting that you mentioned the USB drive or the flash drive in the parking lot, because one of the things that we used to check was that, but also an interesting other technique or test had to do with how might someone circumvent that. Because from what you're describing, it'll be they drop their flash drive, someone will pick it up and plug it into their device. So the individual picks it up and brings it in and plugs it in. But how can they get around that to get it inside the building? And what we started brainstorming was, imagine someone just basically put it into an envelope and mails it in, right? It could be overnight, it could be regular mail, either way. But something along the lines of, too bad you missed the convention or the conference on XYZ. You may want to be aware of some of the different things that were discussed in that conference. So here are the proceedings. Go right ahead and enjoy. And then they take that flash drive and plug it in. So again, different ways from a social engineering perspective that they can get around, and all of that has to do with the human element. So definitely when you mentioned that, it brought some memories, but it also reminded me of some of the techniques and how we need to brainstorm, because that's exactly what the hackers are doing. So we also need to engage in that creative type of exercise with our teams to envision how they may go about it. But go ahead.
So you bring up a good point. If I wanted to attack through the supply chain, I would do that USB drop, knowing maybe you're going to log into my systems. Maybe I give you VPN access into my systems, which may not have the right level of control. Or a lot of people working from home are using personal equipment that may or may not have the right security protections, antivirus in place. So I social engineer you to plug it into your home system, that USB drive, which is then part of a supply chain attack because you're a third-party service provider for me, for example. It's actually, as an example, we'll cover other examples here momentarily. The attack against the Iranian nuclear program, I'm trying to recall the name, this was like 10 years ago, but they were able to convince one of the nuclear engineers to plug in a USB drive that caused 3 0 days to be injected, causing the cycles to spin out of control in the nuclear generation. So they are very creative. As we're looking at this, Hernan, it's almost like a spy movie, thinking really evil thoughts on how are they going to find a way around regular security controls through supply chain to attack an organization.
Now, one of the things that, as you're describing some of these dynamics, one of the things that comes to mind is, what we as individuals need to know and what the people within our organizations need to do. But we need to also make sure that our vendors are doing the same thing with their people, right? Because our data could reside at their facilities. They could be processing our transactions. So we need to make sure that their people are also as aware as our people. And I say our as, the audit organization and the audit client. But anyway, one of the things that I would like to do, and you just mentioned, for example, that government entity and how that was compromised. Do we have some more recent examples of some of these compromised dynamics or environments where something has gone terribly wrong as a result of the cybersecurity framework or cybersecurity breakdowns?
So we have 3 examples I'll quickly explain, few that probably disrupted some people's holiday seasons late last year. First is the Apache Log4j. It's a little code routine built into the Apache Java software library used for logging. It's embedded in many other programs, many other types of systems. So even knowing, does your organization use Apache Log4j? You might just think, well, no, we're not using it directly. You didn't realize that it's built into code that you had purchased maybe a few years ago. So that's where we've seen not necessarily a lot of exploits, but a lot of headaches for organizations as they just try to identify, are they even vulnerable to this type of attack? Another code cove, an example of applying a taxonomy in a real case, identifying particular features. It's a company that provides software for code coverage and testing. April of last year, attackers attained valid credentials for a Docker image. So briefly showed and explained, still using user ID and passwords. That's what happened with Code Cove. Just I was able to gain credentials as a developer injected malicious code within that. And again, when it's propagated as part of a regular code release. So this is where you need to be asking your software vendors, what are their procedures for validating their code? Are they using both static and dynamic code checkers to see if there's vulnerable aspects to their code? And then what are they doing about it? How do they address potential vulnerabilities in their code? Last one, SolarWinds, which I know has caused numerous headaches within the US government, over 30,000 people affected by it. Again, the way it worked, SolarWinds, very well known in the network cybersecurity space. Rather than attacking the US government directly, the attackers knew the US government was using SolarWinds, so they went after them. These are types of advanced persistent threat attacks, APT, often instituted by a foreign government to get into organizations and governments in other countries. Many other examples.
So vigilance is definitely an important part of it, but we need to also look even earlier than that. And one of the things that you alluded here is in terms of our DevSecOps, right? Development, security, and operations, and how we need to make sure that from the development part of it, from the planning stage all the way through, that security is built into everything that we do. So very important takeaway there as well. So what are some of the other things that we need to keep in mind as we're exploring this topic further? There's a lot here, so I just want to make sure that we are benefiting from your insights. So what are some of the other things that we need to know about?
It starts by having the right principles in place, not only for overall cybersecurity, but for supply chain, they're one specific. I'm so glad, Hernan, you mentioned DevSecOps. DevOps is where you get your developers working with operations. You have security as part of it, encompassed throughout, as with the requirements phase, as you're going through the development, the testing, and then as you're performing the updates. So leveraging those DevSecOps types of procedures. Another, building security in early, as you mentioned, develop your defenses, assuming the systems will be breached. Zero trust is a common phrase now used in cybersecurity. So injecting that as part of your supply chain security. With that, you're almost assuming everything can be compromised. You assume that maybe your vendors don't have the right security in place. So, but rather than assuming that a company or product you are using and dealing with is secure, a zero trust approach requires verification of all assets, user accounts and applications, internally and externally. The authentication for access, every piece of authentication must be approved. So zero trust moves security out to the endpoints. It injects the idea of trust but verify into everything internally and externally. Another principle.
Can I jump in for a second,
sure.
Ron? Because there's an interesting thing that you're highlighting that I would like to make sure that I underscore for our viewers. Because as an internal auditor, for many years, the theme, the statement was trust but verify, right? So you kind of start from that premise that you're not going to assume that they are crooks, that they are really trying to defraud you or anything like that. You're going to trust them, okay, but you're going to verify. What we're saying now, especially when it comes to cybersecurity in particular, since that's the topic we're addressing right now, and given the tenor of things around the world, is that you don't even start from the point of trusting, but rather you're going to assume that there's going to be a potential problem, so you're going to have zero trust. So not only when you're going to, let's say, sign up that vendor, and we're going to do the due diligence at that point, which we definitely need to verify certain things, just like we were just talking a moment ago, along the lines of what kind of security do they have in place, and how do we make sure they're training their people, and those kinds of things, which I want to get back to that in a moment and talk some more about those best practices. But before then, so we need to make sure that happens. But every transaction, every activity, every interaction, they need to recertify, re-verify. Are you still who I think you are? Is this transaction still okay? Are you still an authorized user or recipient of this information? So zero trust. I love that idea. So again, it just kind of makes sure that from a risk perspective, we are adapting to the realities of our world where things are so fluid, and not only from day to day, we're talking minute to minute. you can have a situation where someone was okay at one point, now they are not. So that can happen so quickly. So I just wanted to highlight that because I think that's a very important yet fundamental step forward from that prevailing practice that as an auditor, I've been involved in auditing since the 90s, and there are so many things that have changed over the years. But that's one of the things that I remember very well. It was always the trust but verify. Now it is zero trust. So again, just wanted to highlight that. So can we pivot now to best practices, please? Because that'll be very helpful for us to start to take a look at what are some of the things that we need to know within organizations and that we need to start expecting from our supply chain partners as well.
So it starts, well, looking at the people, process, and technologies. Technology alone does not solve this problem. You want to take time to identify who are you reliant on. If you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework or the Center for Internet Security, critical security controls, they both start the same way with this identification and inventory control. Do you have an inventory of everyone you are reliant on, everyone you're connected with, every vendor that you are using, supplier, service provider? Taking the time to conduct that inventory, understanding what their role is and what level of access. This gets back to that zero trust. This way, you can verify that their access is appropriate. Getting down to that least privilege principle. Only give access to what they need for the time that they need it. Another type of information communications technology best practice is running through different checklists. In a little bit, I'll share some of the different checklists that are available and frameworks that are available. I was once part of a panel, large conference a number of years ago on cloud security. And we're talking about the number one thing you need for good cloud security. Do you know what we determined it is, Hernan?
What's that?
A good attorney, a good contract. So believe it or not, it needs to be built into the contract because it could be that you go to your vendor, and I'm pretending I'm talking to a vendor here. And so what security do you have in place? Well, I'm sorry, that's not part of your contract. Yeah, and so very early on with contracting, with the request for proposal.
Ron, it's interesting. Just another important point here is again, we've been talking about the right to audit for a long time, and we've kind of used that as like stock language or a phrase that everyone becomes very familiar with. But one of the things that we don't sometimes talk sufficiently about is not just have the right to audit, but what exactly does that language say? What exactly is the language there? Do you have just the ability to ask them questions? Is it the ability to ask and also receive documents? Do you have the ability to also visit their facilities? Or, what exactly does that entail? And I think we need to be very careful. So I like what you said about making sure that your lawyer is involved and that the language is going to provide those additional elements that will allow you not only to hear, but also to verify, which is what we're talking about earlier.
Right. Well, and it may depend on who the supplier, who your service provider is. If it's a large company like Google, Amazon, Microsoft, they may or may not be willing to share with you, but each of them are certified through other means, SOC 2, FedRAMP. So you can ask, when was the last time they were audited by a third party? Can you share with us that audit certification, that audit report? If it's through payment cards, can they share the report on compliance or ROC with you? So this way you understand from your supplier. But all of this, you need to be diligent in verifying each of your third parties. Don't make the assumption. They may try to do like the salesperson. Oh, trust me, as we talked about with zero trust. Yeah. And then how often do you audit? Do you require annual recertification? How about upon a major change? If you look at the NIST cybersecurity framework, that's actually when you should be reassessing upon any major changes. They may say, well, yeah, you have our audit report from 9 months ago, but the infrastructure has changed completely since then. How do we know the current infrastructure is secure? So all of this is part of evaluating your supply chain risk management program.
So some of these things will be probably around the idea of having a questionnaire that is going to be asking those kind of questions. And I would imagine that NIST probably has some tools along the line for that. Is that correct?
Mm. Oh, yes. I rely very heavily on NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology here in the United States, although it is now being used worldwide. Their cybersecurity framework, even though version 1.1 is a few years old, it's still very viable today. It actually links back to the control document 800-53 Rev 5, which was updated last year as the baseline for security controls. So yes, leverage NIST. They also now have a privacy framework. So if you're handling personally identifiable information, protected health information, cardholder data, tax data, even website browsing cookies, you can use their privacy framework as a form and a checklist for assessing not only yourself, not only specific products and services, but use it as part of your supply chain evaluation as well.
Okay, that's a great resource to know about. So, as we're talking about information and communication, how about we take a look at some of the best practice in terms of cybersecurity, risk management, and how this comes together in that particular space?
So, supply chain risk management needs to be integrated across the business. You mentioned earlier, Hernan, about legacy systems. Another common problem I'll hear from my clients is shadow IT. Organizations will still go out to a big box retailer and buy their own wireless, or they'll buy their own computers, or as you mentioned with healthcare, they'll get a device from a manufacturer, IoT, and they'll plug it into the corporate network. Is your corporate network set up to automatically detect these types of devices or not? Do you have policies and procedures in place that restrict that type of shadow IT? Because again, if I can convince maybe your salesperson to plug something into your network for me through social engineering. So that's the idea of integrating it across the organization, having that formal program, taking time to actually conduct an assessment solely of your organization's supply chain. Plan this within the full life cycle.
So as we're looking at some of these kinds of things, and one of the things that I'm hearing as you're describing some of these things is not only the setup of how the infrastructure is, the inventory, making sure things are configured and the setup of all of these dynamics, but it sounds like monitoring is also a very important piece here. So what kind of monitoring mechanisms and how does this play a role in helping us harden our infrastructure?
We need to be always vigilant on what is being connected to our network, what is being used. So I mentioned anytime someone plugs something in, having that form of monitoring and alerting. Is it 24/7? Or is your alerts going to someone's email box? And again, I see this sometimes as a cybersecurity consultant, VCISO, where organizations are single threaded where one person receives that, or one person has the relationship with the supplier, with the vendor. Well, what if that one employee is not available? Who else can work with that supplier? So that's having your suppliers attest to their security. We're seeing that here in the United States in the Department of Defense with something known as the Capability Maturity Model Certification, or CMMC, where if you're doing business and have defense contracts, you need to actually certify your security. I think we're only going to see that more and more across the board, not only within government infrastructure, but private sector as well. Conducting self-assessments, does your organization self-assess? And as you mentioned, that right to audit, right to assess, do they have third-party assessments? It could be one thing, your supplier says, yes, we conduct our own security. Okay, has that been vetted by some form third-party auditor or not? As I mentioned earlier, formal certifications, you mentioned site visits, that having a relationship. So here's part of this monitoring. Developing good relationships with those suppliers and working with them. One thing I want to mention briefly is incident response. Here's a concern I have with so many is that we may have our own incident response plans in place. Have you tested it though with your suppliers? What if your supplier is a part of what was breached? Can you reach them at any time? What is the SLA they have to respond? It may be written in the contract, they'll have 8 hours. If you're down right now, you're ceasing to function. Can you really wait 8 hours? And then my other big fear is the finger pointing between your supplier and your own IT organization. So it really just takes that time to assess.
So part of that goes back to the inventory and how we need to make sure we know which systems are critical and to what extent, and which systems need to be restored, let's say immediately, which ones in 5 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour, and then to your point, 8 hours. But we probably need to make sure that we have that understanding so we can have it staggered. Again, there's going to be a price implication as well. So you're saying, okay, everybody 8 hours, well, that's probably not okay. And everybody 5 minutes, that's probably not necessary either. So from a cost benefit perspective, make sure that we have a good understanding of what exactly we need when, and then we can start to negotiate and make sure we are covered. Now, the other thing that I also found out, looking at some of these emergency response plans and what they have in place, is if that particular provider is going to support different clients, and depending on whether it's going to be a hot site or what exactly you're going to get from them, are you going to be first in line, second in line, third in line, or whenever there's a slot available for you? Because you may find that you're down the line of priorities just because you got there too late. So once again, your lawyer and making sure you read the fine print. So a very, very important point there as well. Now let's talk about
one other.
frameworks. We mentioned this. Oh, yes, go ahead, please.
So yeah, before we jump into the frameworks, this is why you need to practice. Have a tabletop exercise. If you look at the NIST, actually we're segueing it back to the NIST cybersecurity framework. One of their recommendations, you have your policy for incident response, you have your procedures, but you also need testing and training, not only within your own organization. So when I run tabletop incident response exercises, I'll often bring in key service providers. So this way they are part of the practice, the exercise. So this way IT, if it's internal IT, can work with the service provider to know what they will provide as a part of this, and to know they are allowed the same amount of training. Again, it's part of this whole zero trust, not only at the technical level, but at the procedural level as well.
Exactly, exactly. And to your point about different kinds of ways of testing this, right? So some of that will be the tabletop, some of them will be the live drills and various things like that. So making sure that you not only have in written form, but you actually verify that it's actually going to work. And there have been instances of organizations that have had well-developed, very nicely written programs and plans and response emergency plans. And at the end of the day, when they have a real crisis, nobody knows what to do. So it is not just having it, but making sure it's communicated, everyone is aware, they know what their roles are. And then we also have drills and practices, as the case may be, so everybody is ready if necessary. So as we're talking about frameworks and some of the common criteria, what are some of the things that we need to know? Because there are several frameworks. So what are some of the common criteria, things we need to keep in mind?
Well, the idea with these frameworks is to establish standard. We all should be speaking the same language. It would be like if we're speaking different languages verbally. I'm speaking Spanish and you're speaking some other language. We won't understand each other. So this is why you want to work with your supply chain and use these common frameworks. What I've noticed, though, whether you're working with NIST, ISO, Center for Internet Security, with the HIPAA privacy security, or even the Cloud Security Alliance has their framework as well. It lays out the best practices for access control, for network security control, whether it's boundary, establishing zero trust. How do you protect data in transit while it's being processed? And then while it's being stored, where is your most sensitive data? We were talking earlier about inventory. Do you have a data inventory? Do you know where that data may be within your third-party service providers? How do your service providers conduct risk management? How do they prioritize their risks? We've talked numerous times today, Hernan, about contractual agreements. So having it as part of the contracts. And then I'm a big believer in the human element, the training, the awareness. So what I do is I establish the standards not only internally, but also externally, and that I hold my suppliers accountable for their security.
So one of the things that I'd like to touch upon, we're talking about risk management and the importance of that. Now we're talking so far in this event, we're talking in many cases about our direct client, right? We're auditors within the company or the companies we're going to audit. So our clients, that's fine. Then we have our supply chain, our third parties, right? So we're talking about which are our partners that we also need to be mindful about. So again, we're talking about risk management. How about the subcontractors? So we're talking about risk management. We're talking about that organization that's going to handle some activity for us. It could be payroll, it could be accounting, it could be so many different things. Maybe storing our data or managing our website. What if they have subcontractors? So what are some of the dynamics associated with that? And is that also a big area of concern?
You bring up a great point, Hernan, and this is actually the CMMC, Cybersecurity Maturity Model certification within the Department of Defense. Their concern, asking your suppliers, who are their suppliers? Who are they working with? What is their supply chain risk management processes? How have they vetted their suppliers? It's a fair question to ask today as part of supply chain best practices. Maybe within your request for proposal, you have statements that they vet their suppliers. Because again, if I want to attack an organization, I may even take it down to that level, sub supplier, because all of this can propagate back up to affect the main entity. We saw this again, Log4j is a great example of this, where it was often buried within code that may have been gotten from many other supplies, many other areas. So we should just keep in mind all of the different supply chain best practices, such as purchases, highly controlled. Can someone just go purchase something, or your developers, can they just find code or get code from a friend? So making sure all source code is certified, not only for purchased software, but for any open source or any development projects. Zero trust, evaluating anything that comes into your environment.
Very, very important indeed, Ron. I so much appreciate all your insights and helping us better understand the scale of this dynamic, because as much as it provides opportunities and makes our organization very nimble in terms of what they can do and work with partners who have their expertise there so you can focus on what your organization does, but that also comes with risk. So Ron, thank you so very much for helping us better understand all the dynamics associated with it, the risks, and also some of the different frameworks and the best practices that can help us harden the client's environment and infrastructure so that they can do what they do and do it well and feel a bit more assurance around these dynamics. So thank you so much.
My pleasure, Hernan.
Thanks, Ron and Hernan. To our viewers, if you have any questions, be sure to enter them now in the chat panel on the right side of your screen. Before we get to the Q&As, I'd like to tell you about Audit Pro TV. Audit Pro TV is subscription-based, on-demand audit training that's effective and engaging. A one-year subscription costs less than a 3-day classroom course, and it allows you to gain access to the training you need at any time from anywhere. Visit acilearning.com to learn more about Audit Pro TV and get a free team trial. All right, Dr. Hernan, let's start with our first question.
Great. Thank you very much, Kelly. I really appreciate that. So, Ron, we have a number of questions. Our audience has been very much attuned to what you're describing and also have some questions to continue that exploration of this topic. So here's the first one from Nadia. And she asks, threats and risks are well known. What is more important is how do you verify the compliance of vendors? And how do you make procurement departments aware about all that supply risks and the protection that are needed? So very important question there, Ron. What suggestions do you have for Nadia?
So it's working with your procurement officers to have the security best practices, have your security checklists, whether it's one you have developed, there are ones developed by different third parties. You can use NIST Vendor Security Alliance, VSA, provides a checklist. Another one that I recently was told about applies actually to many others, is the Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit. So what I do is I work with those who are in procurement, and I show them these types of checklists. And we say, okay, as a part of all of our software services or hardware procurement, we need to be asking about security, the security that they have are in place. So it's just being very proactive with your procurement officers to make sure they are aware. And it's not that they're aware of all of the risks, but using some of these examples, take them directly from the news. So this way, it's not just cybersecurity raising the alarm. Oh, there they go again. Everything's a risk. No, you can show the pipeline attack with ransomware, SolarWinds in the news, log for all of the ones that I mentioned, Kaseya, have been in the news. And it's really to prevent these types of headaches. Your procurement people don't want to have to go out and find another vendor if the one you chose happened to be attacked and now you need a replacement vendor. That gets to be very expensive very quickly. So Nadia, I hope I answered your question. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to continue this conversation as well.
Great. Thank you very much, Ron. So we have another question. This one is from Manaswini, and she's asking, what about the risk of bots and SQL injections?
So all of those should be caught through regular validation, whether it's validation of the code through vulnerability scanning. So making sure you scan any of your vendor's code, they go through their processes to scan. As far as code injection, that is normally through some type of a website or an application. I'll often ask my software providers about OWASP. OWASP top 10, very well known. So I'll actually ask my vendors, how well are you involved with your OWASP community? And they should be talking about how they test their own code, how they're involved. You could include even hardware such as a web application firewall to be looking for that. You can put this as part of your network's defense. Back to that zero trust type of an architecture, not trusting anything. So even if there is a code injection, it should be stopped by your network defenses. Another wonderful question.
Great. Thank you very much. Yes, we have a very much an engaged audience today. So we have a question from Emmanuel asking, what role does the state play in curbing cyber attacks? So could we see a big impact if there is a form of international organization to check countries that harbor unethical hackers? Very interesting question here. I'm not sure what your thoughts are regarding this, but what do you think? What's your thought about this?
We actually do have numerous international organizations and national organizations looking at this. First of all, here within the United States is the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, CISA.gov, has tremendous resources. I encourage you, take a hold of this slide deck. Look at the bottom at the references. I do reference CISA for their supply chain best practices. There's also an organization known as NIST. I'm pulling it up right now to make sure I say it correctly. It's the European Union's Information Security Agency. They actually have their own threat landscape for supply chain attack report from July of 2021. It's the European Union Agency for Cybersecurity, or ENISA. Read that report. If you find this topic fascinating, this report is must reading. It goes into good detail about the SolarWinds attack, about the CodeBev attack, about many of these attacks, and then what we can be doing about it as an international community. If you think about it, this is an international problem. It's not just one government going after another. We're seeing this throughout the world. So together, we can solve this problem. So CISA and NISA are two fantastic resources I can't recommend enough.
Now, one of the things that I believe I've heard about as well is that in addition to the states and how they have organizations like the one that you just shared, there's also a lot of effort put around looking not only at state actors, but also at organized crime And that's another thing we also need to be on the lookout for. So our viewers should also be on the lookout for that. So thank you very much, Ron, for helping us better appreciate how we have some of these state actors also helping us identify some of these threats and how they're trying to put pressure to make them go away. So that's very helpful. So we have another question. Nadia is asking, when you speak about asset classification or asset register, how can we enforce that each department in our company has a responsibility to classify the assets they own?
Mhm.
The struggle is that people simply don't know what asset classification is and how to make it.
So keep it simple. Start with the highest risk type of assets. I also teach, and I'll have some students say, well, you need to inventory everything. No, you don't. You don't need to inventory pens and mice. No, start with what is the highest risk, highest value type of asset. So the computer systems, of course, you need the programs that are on those. Try to automate as much as possible as well. Trying to maintain this manually is very cumbersome. So do you have a program in place? And you can often do this through the Microsoft Windows infrastructure, through other types of automated inventory management systems that'll track both hardware and software assets. So taking that burden off of people, putting in the network access control. So this way, anytime anything's plugged in, you have a central source that is notified. And then you can add that to your asset inventory. The more you can automate that, the better. And then once it comes up as a new resource, taking steps, so you have a procedure, you find out who owns that resource. You have a configuration management database, CMDB, which then attributes who or what that resource is, who is the owner, maybe who is the administrator. It could be two different people. Who's the one responsible for it? What is the purpose for that asset? Why was it procured? Where I find this is really valuable, chief financial officers love this because it saves the company money rather than each department buying their own IT. When it goes through central purchasing, then buy it once, use many times across an organization. So it's taking it just from a security viewpoint, looking at this, how do we solve this from a business lens? Good question again, Nadia.
Great, Ron. Thank you very much. Very helpful information there. So we have a question from Olive, who's asking, we need to strengthen our controls, and someone mentioned the implementation of software bill of materials. Is this worth investing time and money on?
Most definitely. So software bill of materials, it's a way to inventory your software. But let's look at it. Say you buy a new refrigerator. What comes with it? You get a big manual that explains all of the technical components of that refrigerator, explains how to fully use it. Do we get that with our software today? Quite often we don't. What are all of the features that we have with the software? What are the underlying technologies, underlying procedures as a part of that software? That's the idea of a software bill of materials, or SBOM. And yes, the people who generated it know the jokes behind that name. So, but SBOM has proven, particularly with the Log4j, to be a vital component of software purchases today. It's a formal machine-readable inventory of software components and dependencies, information about those components and their hierarchical relationships. So if you have an SBOM, software bill of materials, it would have caught that you are using procedure calls like Log4j. I highly recommend taking time to learn more about it. We're going to see this now mandated more and more in contracts, that software does have a bill of materials that goes with it. There are standardized formats for it. To learn more, the website is ntia.gov/SBOM, or of course, just look up internet search engine software bill of materials. It's actually very well documented.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much again, Ron. We have a question from Maggie asking, is there a common framework or standardized checklist that organizations can use to improve vendor security?
One of the challenges we see now, Maggie, is that there are many different checklists. You can go and purchase a risk management system, compliance system that may have a checklist that matches the NIST cybersecurity framework built into it. I mentioned earlier, there's the Vendor Security Alliance, VSA, that has a checklist that you can give to your vendors. Caveat with it is that checklist hasn't been updated since 2019, a little bit dated. There's the Security Assessment Standardized Information Gathering Questionnaire, or SIG. It's been around for many, many years. Caveat with that is it's no longer free. It is subscription-based, but it is very robust. Another one I mentioned earlier is that Higher Education Community Vendor Assessment Toolkit. The idea, though, let's use an analogy. Our electricity. How do you know the light bulb you plug in, the appliance you plug into electricity isn't going to blow a circuit? It's through the underwriter's laboratory. Anything electrical needs to go and be tested to make sure it's not going to blow anything up. We're slowly seeing that in the cybersecurity community. Actually, the underwriter's laboratory is now looking at cybersecurity standards as well. This way, before anything is plugged in, whether it's software, hardware, you name it, is pre-vetted. This way we can have a trustworthy infrastructure for our internal and within our supply chain. Another great question, Hernan.
Very good. Thank you so much. These answers are very, very helpful. We have one from Evan asking, trust but verify seemed good at one point, but not anymore. Is zero trust across the supplier network better?
As you brought up earlier, Hernan, yes, it is. It's becoming the de facto standard. NIST has documents on it, as well as many others. So it's not just trying to do it upon yourself. What I like with NIST is that now you can say, well, according to a national standard, we need to implement zero trust architecture. So it's not like you don't trust your vendors. It's just, we can't trust anything on the internet anymore until it's properly vetted and verified. So it's not that we don't no longer trust, but it's just that it's a trust with built-in verification. This way, actually, it builds into trust. It allows us to be freer. So follow a lot of the zero trust architecture documents that are available from NIST and many others to enable it. So to have access control in place at the software level, the user level, and the network level. This way, you know what's happening across your internal network and within your suppliers.
Ron, thank you very much for helping us better understand these dynamics and for answering all of these questions. So generous with your knowledge and helping us better understand these dynamics and how we can help our organizations. And thank you to our viewers too, who have been very much engaged and asking all of these questions, which continue to expand the learning, and we all benefit from your questions. So thank you very much. So absolutely. So this is very good. I definitely enjoy this type of encounter where we can have a conversation about some of these topics that are so important, so relevant, that we need to know about, because there are so many dynamics to really be on the lookout for. So thank you again. And to our viewers, thank you for watching. And please stay tuned, because we are offering these webcasts periodically. We have them every month. So please stay tuned, because we'll continue to advertise these and let you know what's coming up next. And we hope that you'll join us again. There's a lot to learn, and we're glad to share what we know, and also glad to share with the people who have this depth of knowledge like Ron did today. So thank you very much to everyone. Thank you, and I hope that we can meet again soon. Bye.
Thank you for joining today's webinar. You will receive a link to the webinar recording delivered to your inbox. See you next time.